Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Kai never imagined that the most defining turning point of his life would come from a truth so raw, so painful, and so devastatingly personal. For months, perhaps longer, he had clung to the illusion that Drew was a man of strength, a figure of guidance, someone whose influence could help him carve out a place in Port Charles. But in reality, Drew had been nothing more than a master manipulator, and Kai Yong, eager and desperate for belonging, had allowed himself to become nothing more than a pawn in the schemes of a man who thrived on betrayal. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, sweeping away whatever pride he once had. Drew was not the ally he had believed in, but a serpent who had slowly, methodically poisoned every connection around him. And worse, Kai was forced to admit that by following Drew blindly, he had directly contributed to the unraveling of Trina's family. He had pushed Curtis into peril, handed Drew opportunities that endangered Stella, and shattered the delicate trust that might have existed between him and the people he cared most about. It was not just guilt, it was a scar that cut into the very core of his identity, branding him as someone who had been complicit in the destruction of the only family that had ever offered him true acceptance. The shame ate at him relentlessly. Every glance from Trina, filled with disappointment and heartbreak, every subtle tension in Portia's voice, and every cold silence from Curtis became a reminder of what he had done. Kai's heart became a battlefield where remorse clashed violently with his desperate yearning to make things right. He knew deep down that forgiveness was not something he could simply ask for, it had to be earned, and not in small gestures but in acts so undeniable that even the deepest wounds could begin to heal. If he remained silent, if he continued to hide behind excuses or apologies, he would lose Trina forever, and her family would never see him as anything more than Drew's misguided lackey. So in the quiet torment of his conscience, Kai made a decision that would alter his fate. He would put everything on the line, even his life, to redeem himself in the eyes of Trina and her family. That chance came in the most harrowing way imaginable through Stella's abduction. The moment Drew's men seized her, the fragile balance holding the Eschard Robinson family together cracked. Curtis's anguish was palpable, nearly unbearable, as he wrestled with the thought that his beloved and had been reduced to nothing more than a bargaining chip. Portia's worry festered into dread, and Trina's faith in justice seemed to slip further away with each passing hour. It was chaos, it was despair, and it was all orchestrated by Drew. For Kai, however, Stella's capture was more than a tragedy. It was an opportunity. He saw it as the one chance he had left to atone for his past, to prove that his loyalty to Drew had died the moment the truth was revealed, and that he now stood firmly on the side of the family he had once betrayed. Kai's mind worked quickly, sketching out a plan that was as daring as it was dangerous. He knew he could not simply storm into Drew's operation and rescue Stella. Brute force would only end in disaster. Instead, he would need to use the very thing that Drew had once valued in him, his cunning. To succeed, Kai would have to walk a razor-thin line, pretending to maintain his allegiance to Drew long enough to gain access to his secrets, while quietly orchestrating his downfall behind the scenes. It was an act of deception that could end in his death if Drew detected even the slightest crack in his performance. Yet Kai embraced the risk, because anything less than full commitment would leave Stella in danger and his chance at redemption wasted. Feigning loyalty, Kai approached Drew with the same deference and subtle eagerness that had once made him useful. He allowed Drew to believe that his betrayal of Curtis and his manipulation of Stella had not soured their bond, but rather deepened his resolve to be part of Drew's twisted empire. Drew, blinded by arrogance and the conviction that he still held Kai's loyalty, welcomed him back into the fold. This misplaced confidence became Drew's greatest mistake. When Drew bragged about his dominance, hinting at how Curtis's fate was sealed, Kai carefully planted suggestions, feeding Drew's paranoia and subtly steering the conversation toward Stella's imprisonment. Drew, convinced that he was speaking with a trusted confidant, let slip more details than he should have. Piece by piece, the puzzle of Stella's location fell into place. The coded references Drew used to mask his operations were not enough to conceal the truth from Kai, who had spent months shadowing his strategies and learning the way he thought. Drew's arrogance blinded him to the possibility that Kai could be decoding his words in real time. In one chilling moment, when Drew alluded to the safe place near the docks where no one dares to tread, Kai knew exactly where Stella was being held. His heart raced not out of fear, but out of relief. For the first time since his betrayal, he held power not to destroy, but to save. Yet rescuing Stella was only part of his mission. Kai understood that bringing her to safety would be a temporary victory unless Drew himself was neutralized. So alongside his rescue plan, Kai laid the groundwork for a trap. He whispered in Drew's ear about a supposed opportunity to eliminate Curtis once and for all, fabricating a scenario so tantalizing that Drew's ego could not resist. In doing so, Kai ensured that Drew would follow the trail he had prepared, a trail leading directly into a carefully constructed snare. In that moment, Kai was no longer the manipulated pawn of a powerful man. He was the architect of Drew's undoing, the one who dared to risk his life not for personal gain but for love, for redemption, and for justice. And as the plan moved forward, Kai carried within him the weight of every mistake he had made, the burning hope that Trina might one day see past them, and the unshakable determination to prove that he was more than his past sins. He was a man transformed, forged in guilt but rising through courage, ready to face whatever price fate demanded of him. The moment Kai cut through Stella's bindings and helped her to her feet was a moment that transcended mere strategy. It was the culmination of months of lies, regrets, and guilt pouring into a single act of courage. Stella had resigned herself to the idea that she might never escape Drew's grip, and she had certainly given up on the thought that Kai could ever be her savior. To her, he was one of the reasons she was here in the first place. He had once stood shoulder to shoulder with Drew, had once let himself be used as a tool for manipulation and betrayal, and Stella, with her fierce loyalty to Curtis and Trina, had every reason to despise him. But when the ropes fell and she looked into his eyes, she saw something that caught her breath, a look of raw sincerity, a desperate urgency that could not be faked. In those eyes, she saw not a boy lost in shadows, but a man who had chosen to face his own mistakes. Her heart, hardened by disappointment, felt an unexpected spark of hope. Curtis, meanwhile, had been spiraling deeper into despair by the hour. His aunt, the woman who had been his anchor and conscience, was gone, taken by Drew's forces to be dangled like bait in a cruel game of control. He had imagined the worst, replayed 100 terrible scenarios of Stella's suffering, each one twisting the knife in his chest. But when he laid eyes on her safe and freed, when Stella clutched his arm with trembling relief, Curtis felt the weight of hopelessness lift just slightly. He wanted to collapse into gratitude, but what struck him most forcefully was the realization that Kai had been the one to bring her back. The same Kai who had once driven him into danger was now the one delivering him a miracle. It was confusing, maddening even, but Curtis couldn't deny the fact staring him in the face. Kai had changed. Yet with every breath of relief came the chilling awareness that this act would not go unnoticed. Drew was too calculating, too paranoid, not to sense betrayal. Stella's sudden liberation was a rift in his carefully crafted illusion of control, and Kai knew it would not take long before Drew's suspicion sharpened into certainty. The mask Kai had worn pretending loyalty, feigning subservience, was already cracking. The timing could not have been tighter. He had freed Stella, but he had also lit the fuse. Drew would be hunting for answers, and soon, his eyes would turn toward Kai. This realization might have paralyzed another man, but not Kai. Not anymore. The boy who had once lived in fear of Drew's approval and disapproval was gone. The man standing here now had embraced the inevitability of risk, had accepted that the game he was playing was nothing short of deadly. The truth was simple and merciless. If he failed, he would die, hunted down by Drew and his network of loyal, ruthless allies. Yet strangely, this truth no longer filled him with dread. Instead, it gave him clarity. He was no longer hiding in guilt. He was no longer seeking escape. He had chosen his path, and if it ended with his life, then it would end with dignity, not shame. What fueled him was something larger than fear, love, and redemption. Trina's face, etched with hurt but also with the possibility of forgiveness, burned in his memory like a flame. Every beat of his heart told him that he could not give up, that she deserved a man willing to risk everything to protect her and her family. His guilt over betraying Curtis became fuel, a constant reminder that mistakes could only be atoned for through action, not words. And Stella's trembling gratitude was proof that even those who had written him off could see change if it was carved into reality. Kai's plan was now in motion, and it had to work. He had woven a trap out of Drew's own arrogance, baiting him with whispers of Curtis's supposed betrayal, luring him into the belief that his rival was plotting behind his back. Every word Kai had spoken had been measured, every suggestion carefully planted, until Drew's paranoia bloomed into obsession. The path had been laid, brick by brick, a labyrinth of lies disguised as truths. Drew, convinced of his superiority, was walking into it blindly. The brilliance of Kai's strategy lay in its simplicity. He didn't need to overpower Drew with brute strength or armies of allies. He only needed Drew to believe in his own invincibility long enough to stumble into his downfall. Kai had studied him closely, his patterns, his pride, his need to dominate, and he knew Drew would not be able to resist chasing what he thought was an opportunity to crush Curtis once and for all. What Drew failed to realize was that every step he took was one Kai had calculated, every decision he made was one Kai had predicted. Still, I could not ignore the danger. Drew was ruthless, and when he discovered the truth, and he inevitably would, his retaliation would be swift and merciless. Kai had to be faster, sharper, and utterly fearless. There would be no second chances. If his deception faltered, even for a heartbeat, Drew would strike. Kai's blood would be spilled, and his efforts would die with him. But what steadied Kai was the knowledge that his cause was no longer selfish. He wasn't fighting for power or recognition. He was fighting for Trina, for Stella, for Curtis, and for Portia. He was fighting to dismantle a man whose shadow had poisoned them all. As Stella clung to Curtis, Kai stood silently in the background, watching the family he had nearly destroyed begin to heal in the smallest of ways. He didn't dare intrude. He didn't dare seek thanks. This wasn't about him. It was about them. Yet in that quiet moment, he allowed himself a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Trina would see what he had done and understand that he was no longer the man who had once betrayed her. Maybe she would see that he was willing to risk everything in his life to make things right. Drew's suspicion grew stronger by the hour, and Kai could feel the storm gathering. Every instinct in him screamed that the final confrontation was close. He tightened his resolve, steeling himself for the inevitable. He knew the snare he had set was ready, but what lay beyond it was uncertain. Would Drew fall, or would Kai himself be consumed in the fire he had lit? That question loomed heavy, but Kai no longer ran from uncertainty. He embraced it. For Kai, this was more than a battle against Drew. It was a battle against the man he used to be the coward, the follower, the pawn. And in every step he took toward the showdown, he buried that man deeper, replacing him with someone who was ready to stand in the light, no matter the cost. Kai had transformed his guilt into a weapon, his love into armor, and his intelligence into a blade. Drew was walking into a labyrinth with no exit, and Kai was waiting at its heart, ready to face the consequences of everything he had become. The final trap Kai constructed was not hastily devised, nor was it reliant on brute force. It was crafted with precision, foresight, and a ruthless understanding of Drew's psyche. Kai knew that Drew's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness, his suspicion of others, his obsessive need to maintain dominance, and his tendency to believe that betrayal lurked around every corner. Kai fed this paranoia with carefully planted whispers, encrypted files deliberately altered, and staged encounters designed to implicate Curtis as the true traitor. He made Drew believe that Curtis had been secretly working with outside forces, quietly aligning himself with allies powerful enough to dismantle Drew's empire. Every piece of false evidence was layered with just enough credibility to bypass Drew's skepticism, playing directly into the fears Drew carried about losing control. It was not simply a matter of telling lies, it was about weaving a tapestry that Drew could not resist pulling apart. The deeper Drew dug, the more convinced he became of Curtis's betrayal. He began chasing shadows, scrutinizing every move Curtis made, interpreting every silence as collusion, and every delay as conspiracy. Kai guided him like a puppet master, placing breadcrumbs that seemed too authentic to question, until Drew's paranoia became an obsession that consumed his judgment. He no longer thought rationally or reacted with rage, convinced he was steps away from crushing his supposed rival once and for all. But in reality, every step he took led him closer to the trap Kai had locked tight. Curtis and Portia could not fully see the scope of Kai's plan, but they began to sense something shifting. They saw a young man no longer drifting aimlessly between loyalties, no longer the pliable pawn who once served Drew's dark agenda. Instead, they witnessed Kai acting with purpose, with clarity, and with a courage that spoke louder than words. Even if they did not yet understand the full mechanics of the deception, they could feel the intent behind it. Kai was no longer standing on the sidelines or being used as a tool. He was fighting back, not for himself, but for them. But Kai knew better than anyone that the success of his scheme did not mean absolute safety. Drew was no ordinary adversary. He was cunning, relentless, and most dangerous when cornered. Kai understood that once the truth dawned on Drew, once he realized he had been outmaneuvered by the very man he had once considered expendable, his fury would ignite with lethal intensity. Drew would not accept defeat quietly. He would retaliate with everything at his disposal. Allies hidden in the shadows could be summoned, threats could be escalated, and blood could be spilled. The trap might ensnare Drew, but it could just as easily unleash chaos. Despite this knowledge, Kai pressed forward without hesitation. The danger did not weaken him, it strengthened his resolve. He had already made peace with the possibility of death, because for him, this was no longer about survival, it was about redemption. Rescuing Stella had proven to himself and to the family that he was capable of change, but it wasn't enough. To him, it had to go further. It had to show Trina, above all, that he was willing to risk everything, even his life, to protect those she loved most. Each move he made in this dangerous game was not only to dismantle Drew's grip but also to carve a new identity for himself. No longer the boy blinded by false promises, but a man choosing to stand in the light. In a town like Port Charles, where deception was currency and betrayal lay hidden beneath every handshake, Kai's choice stood out as something rare, almost luminous. His actions were not about power or ambition but about proving that loyalty, once broken, could be rebuilt through sacrifice. He was not playing for dominance, he was playing for redemption, for trust, for love. This transformation became his greatest weapon. He was no longer shackled by Drew's manipulation, no longer lost in shadows. With every calculated move, with every step closer to exposing Drew, Kai was reclaiming control of his story. He was no longer a victim of circumstance, but the architect of his own fate. And so, as Drew advanced further into the labyrinth of lies Kai had constructed, blinded by rage and convinced of Curtis's betrayal, Kai stood steady in the knowledge that his trap was closing. The final confrontation loomed, and though uncertainty still hung heavy in the air, Kai was ready. Whether it ended in triumph or tragedy, he had chosen his path, and for the first time, it was entirely his own. He had become a man who no longer ran from the darkness, but who created light within it, shaping his destiny with both courage and sacrifice. The lingering question that hovered in the air after Stella's rescue was one that refused to dissolve with celebration or relief. Had Kai done enough to redeem himself in the eyes of Trina? Or had he simply lit the fuse of his own destruction? The trap he had so carefully constructed had worked flawlessly, pulling Drew deeper and deeper into a maze of false evidence, paranoia, and blind rage until the man's own arrogance delivered him to the very edge of ruin. Stella was free, her safety restored not by chance but by Kai's deliberate defiance, and Curtis could finally breathe without the crushing weight of despair that had nearly broken him. For one fleeting moment, it felt as though the balance of power in Port Charles had shifted, that Drew's stranglehold had weakened, and that the family Kai had betrayed was beginning to glimpse hope again. Yet beneath that fragile triumph lay an unshakable truth. Kai had not ended the war, had merely moved it to a new battlefield. For Kai, the victory was bittersweet, almost hollow, because it carried with it the weight of uncertainty. Trina had looked at him when she learned what he had done, and in her eyes, he could not read salvation or condemnation. There was something guarded there, a flicker of recognition that he had risked everything to save Stella, but also a shadow of memory. The reminder that it was his choices in the past that had helped Drew entrench his power and endanger her family in the first place. How could one act, no matter how courageous, erase the scars of betrayal? Kai understood that love and forgiveness were not currencies easily earned in Port Charles, especially not from someone as principled and fiercely loyal as Trina. He had given her a reason to doubt him once, and doubt was the kind of wound that festered long after apologies were spoken. His act of defiance might open a door, but whether she would walk through it was a question that only time could answer. Still, Kai did not regret what he had done, nor did he waver in the path he had chosen. For the first time in his life, his actions had not been about self-preservation, ambition, or loyalty to someone stronger than himself. They had been about doing what was right, regardless of the cost. He had transformed guilt into resolve and fear into strength, and in that transformation, he had reclaimed something that Drew had stolen from him long ago: his autonomy. Whether Trina forgave him or not, whether Curtis ever fully trusted him again, Kai knew that this was the man he wanted to be, someone who acted not for gain but for love, for justice, and for redemption. But Drew was not finished. That was the truth that loomed like a thundercloud on the horizon. For all the brilliance of Kai's deception, for all the precision with which he had manipulated Drew's suspicions and guided him into the trap, Drew was still alive, and Drew was still dangerous. A man like him did not fall quietly. He did not retreat into shadows licking his wounds. He retaliated. And Kai, more than anyone, understood what kind of storm was about to descend upon them. By outsmarting Drew, by daring to expose his weakness, Kai had not simply defeated him, had humiliated him. And humiliation was something Drew would never forgive. The retaliation would not be straightforward. Drew was too clever for that. It would come in ways unseen, in whispers carried through the alleys of Port Charles, and deals struck in secret, and allies summoned from the shadows. His empire, though shaken, was vast and deeply rooted. Political favors, criminal networks, corrupt officials, all these threads were still in his grasp, and Drew would pull them tighter now, wrapping Kai and anyone close to him in a noose woven of power and vengeance. Port Charles was a city where loyalty could be bought, where silence could be enforced with violence, and Drew would use every weapon available to remind the world that he was not a man to be mocked. Kai felt this looming danger like a weight pressing on his chest, but rather than shrink from it, he steeled himself for what was to come. He knew that the path he had chosen was not one of peace but of war. He had saved Stella, yes, but in saving her, he had declared himself Drew's enemy, and in Port Charles, being the enemy of a man like Drew was a death sentence. Yet Kai accepted it willingly. He had already lived too long in Drew's shadow, bound by fear and manipulation. Better to risk death in the light of truth than to survive forever in the suffocating dark of servitude. Trina's presence in his thoughts gave him both strength and torment. He could not deny that every move he made was in part for her, to prove that he was not the coward she had believed him to be, that he was capable of sacrifice and loyalty. But the question lingered: was his transformation enough to heal what he had broken, or would she always see him as the boy who chose Drew over her family? Every time he caught a glimpse of her, every time her eyes met his, he felt the pull of that question tearing at him. He longed for her forgiveness, but he knew he could not demand it. All he could do was keep fighting, keep proving through action that he was worthy of her trust, even if she never gave it again. For Curtis and Portia, the shift was equally complex. They owed him gratitude for saving Stella, and they could not deny the courage it had taken to turn against Drew. But gratitude was not the same as trust, and forgiveness was not the same as acceptance. To them, Kai was still an unknown quantity, a man standing on the border between ally and liability. They would watch him carefully, weighing every action, every choice, waiting to see whether his transformation would endure or collapse under the pressure of Drew's inevitable counterattack. And so Kai stood on the precipice of a new chapter. Stella's rescue had closed one door, but it had flung open another, revealing a corridor lined with shadows, where every step forward brought new dangers. Drew was plotting, Trina's heart was uncertain, Curtis and Portia were wary, and the city itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether Kai would rise fully into the man he aspired to be or whether he would be crushed under the weight of his past. The truth was stark. Kai's journey was only beginning. The victory over Drew was not an ending but an invitation to war. Every choice ahead would carry consequences, every move would test his resolve, and every heartbeat would remind him that redemption was not a single act but a lifetime of proving oneself. Whether Trina forgave him, whether Drew destroyed him, whether Curtis and Portia ever truly welcomed him, these were questions without answers. But one thing was certain: Kai was no longer the boy who lived in Drew's shadow. He had become a man determined to write his own fate, even if ink was drawn from his own blood.